Maybe you're all networked out now. It's in the afternoon phase, but I hope in the next presentation by Asprof, Associate Professor Martin Pitt will bring you back to the exciting topic of visualization. So Martin is currently Associate Professor of Healthcare Modelling and Simulation at Exeter University, Medical School in the UK. He has a specific interest in promoting more effective implementation of models in healthcare, especially in the use of information visualization techniques to improve communication and understanding of outputs to key user groups. And you've also advised NICE in the past. I think it's changed from the National Institute of Clinical Excellence to something else people have been telling me of. So without further ado, I'll let you get ahead and do your presentation.
Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. Before I start, I'd just like to ask, how many people here are familiar with health technology assessment? Can you put your hands up? Oh, that's good, because a lot of this is setting the context. So I was going to start off by telling you a little bit about health technology assessment, and particularly how it's taken shape in the UK, particularly England, which is where I work and a number of other people here do. But I realise a lot of people here are not familiar with that background. So what I'd like to do is to start by setting the context and talking a little bit about the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, as it's now called. It's changed its name twice since it was established in 1998, and what health technology assessment is. To give you a sense, I think it will become increasingly relevant internationally, and it's grown substantially in the last 10 to 15 years. Then I'll talk a little bit about what we've done in terms of visualization. So we're looking at visualization now in a very specific application area. So hopefully this makes it real in terms of a particular focus area of application. In particular, I'm going to concentrate on cost effectiveness modeling, which is the area that I was most involved with. And then I'll make some general points at the end about where I think this is going and what the potential is for future work. So anybody who's not familiar with the process of NICE in the UK, it's a government, what they call a government quango, really. It's an agency that operates underneath the Department of Health. That's what DH stands for there. And it advises about which health interventions should be should be used by the National Health Service in the UK. And as you can imagine, that's quite an involved process. So when a new drug, for example, a new pharmaceutical comes onto the market, it is assessed both in terms of the clinical evidence and in terms of the cost effectiveness of the intervention. And then on the basis of an appraisal committee meeting, it's either accepted or not, or sometimes it's accepted under certain conditions or for certain subgroups of the population. So we get to the process where we can issue guidance. And that's a very involved, but also a very structured process. And it's fair to say there's quite a lot of transparency in the process. These are the agencies that are involved. First of all, there's NICE, the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence. Used to be based in London, now based both in London and Manchester. And then there's a body called the NETSCI, NIHR, National Institute of Health Research, Evaluation Trials and Studies Coordinating Centre. And they sort of an agency which farms out the work to the purple dots, which are at the moment 9 regional technology assessment research teams, largely based in universities, not exclusively. There's some that are sort of commercial organisations that do the work, but mostly university teams. And what they do is they produce these things up here. If I can get this to work. Called, sorry about the resolution of the picture, they're called technology assessment reports, and they form an essential part of the appraisal process for each of the interventions under review. And it's worth mentioning that those are also made available on the web, and anybody, anywhere can download those as PDFs. So there's an awful lot of transparency, and it also raises the issue that they have to be understandable, not just to an expert panel, but also to people who might be interested from the public, for example, from lobbying groups for particular diseases, and to other researchers. So there's a wide range of audiences that these reports need to be applicable to, and that's important to take into account. Broadly speaking, the health technology assessment reports fall into 2 main areas. One is a review of the clinical effectiveness, and there's lots of meta-analysis evidence synthesis and systematic review that gets done to look at that, drawing on all the clinical trials, for example, but potentially lots of other sources where those aren't available, and those can vary enormously. And then the second part, which is the cost effectiveness part of the report, which analyzes through economic modeling what the likely cost utility is in comparison with alternative treatments. And I'll say a lot more about that, so we'll move on. And what I'd like to talk about is the report that, oops, oh yeah. It's worth stating that this stuff is highly political and often highly controversial. Anybody who lives in the UK will know this because there's frequent news reports both on telly and in paper, like these examples show, of some of the controversy that surrounds whether a drug is or is not accepted by NICE. So there's quite a lot of political charge involved, and sometimes quite a lot of money through lawyers and so on that are employed to appeal against judgments by NICE, for example. It's one of the few areas I know where modelling in healthcare can attract so much attention in the general media, which I guess is in a way is good because it makes us feel we're doing something that impacts if it's raising that kind of attention. And the work I'd like to report is this largely done by a PhD student I supervised, Will Starr-Timmons, who's there. You can tell he's a designer because he's got red glasses, and it was great to work with the guy because it really came in with a fresh set of ideas and came in from a designer's perspective, whereas most of the people I work with in the research group where I work are scientists and don't have quite the same perception of things. So it was a nice mix of skills that we had in this project. And that's just showing an initial analysis he did, looking at the whole range of health technology assessment reports, showing where there were graphics and what kind of graphics were used. So that was one of the first pieces of work he did, was to analyze what was currently being used in the health technology assessment reports. All sorts of different sorts of graphics, but not, to be honest, not a great deal of them, and fairly unevenly distributed through the different sections of the reports. And that's just one example. I'm only going to show one example of an information graphic that we designed relating to systematic review. Anybody who's looked at these tables before will know that's a completely different representation of what you often get in reports where they looked at a range of different clinical trials. Normally you just get a table of numbers. So he's replaced all the numbers with a series of different graphical devices. So for example, here we've got a map showing where the trial took place in the world. Here we've got a map showing the protocol of the trial. Here we've got the sort of sex and quality indicators, all using graphical devices. And he actually prototyped a tool that can create that chart based on inputted parameters. So it's potentially very useful. And we've actually evaluated that tool in our study and showed it to be very effective in conveying a quick impression of what the systematic review evidence showed. I mean, obviously, if you wanted more detail, you might need the numbers for more accuracy, but that was extremely useful, and all the people we showed it to thought as much. So I want to turn to cost-effectiveness modelling, which is more kind of home territory for me, which is the area I worked in when I worked in health technology assessment. And it's interesting to look at the process of modelling in this area, because it started with very little modelling at all. It wasn't recognised as necessary for making these kind of policy decisions. And as the sort of economics of healthcare became more and more pressing for the NHS in the UK, it was realised that we needed more and more sophisticated modelling in order to represent what the cost effectiveness of an intervention might be, as well as just the clinical effectiveness. And you can see there's been a steady increase in the sophistication and certainly in the frequency of the modelling approaches that have been used in health technology assessment. Arguably, the dominant standard now is this one, probabilistic Markov modelling, which is largely done in Excel, actually, primarily because Excel is such a portable medium. Most people have got a copy of Excel. If you use some sophisticated or expensive piece of software, it's not going to be easily shareable between the different players that need to see the models. And that's a very simple representation of the kind of modelling we do. We use a state transition framework so that we can represent patient pathways in terms of a series of patient states. And this is about as simple as they come. You've got a state a stable state where disease is progressing, and a state where people have died in that model. And the parameters that you need to use to make that model work relate to, first of all, the cost of each state. So for each period of time that you call the cycle in a Markov model, there's a cost attached. The utility of that state. Are people familiar with utility? It's basically how well you are on a scale, broadly speaking, 0 to 1, although technically it goes into minus numbers sometimes, but where 0 represents death and 1 represents full health. So death was always 0. And then you need the probabilities of transferring across from one state in the model to another. So at each cycle, patients who are in the stable state in this model have a 0.12 probability of progressing to the progression state. And those transition probabilities might easily vary between different drugs, different interventions, based on the data sets that you have available. There's also other parameters to do with the structure of the model and how long you model for, the so-called time horizon of the model. So broadly speaking, when you create a cost-effectiveness model in healthcare, you have 4 sets of data that you use. But importantly, those data are never fixed points, because there's a lot of uncertainty, as we all know, there's a lot of uncertainty attached to each of those data points, broadly speaking, for all of them. And when you've done that, you can run the model with one set of data, and you can run for the comparator, that maybe it's placebo, maybe it's the existing treatment, and you can run the set of data using trial information, for example, and cost data that you'll know for a new intervention, treatment A. And you can put that on a graph where you've got cost at one side and quality adjusted life years along there, which is broadly speaking a measure of overall benefit. It's trying to universalize, if you like, the benefit measure. And that's typically what you'll get. You'll get an increase in cost and an increase in quality. So it's against the original case. And if you put the comparator in the middle, then you can create what's called an incremental cost effectiveness plane, where you've got 4 quadrants. So the new treatment will either come in this quadrant, where it's going to, if it appears there, it's going to cost more and do less benefit and cost more, so it's not much of a decision to be made there. We should call it a no-brainer quadrant. If it does there, it costs less but does more, so it's a pretty good argument for adopting it. So those are called the no-brainer quadrants, because you can pretty much be clear that you're going to adopt those technologies if they exist in those quadrants, or not adopt them if it comes in the northwest quadrant. And then most of the interventions, new interventions that you look at, will come there. They'll cost more and deliver more at the same time. Then there's a judgment needed. Sometimes it's an interesting quadrant. Sometimes they even come there where they cost less but do less. That's unusual and much discussed, but we won't dwell on it now. So typically, the new treatment will come somewhere in the northeast quadrant. And typically, it won't be a point. It'll be a cloud of points, because if you run the models as a simulation, sampling from distributions that represent the uncertainty underlying the parameters, then you'll get a cloud of points, not just 1 point. That's important. And this really leads to what's known as the primary metric in cost-effectiveness analysis. It's called the incremental cost-effectiveness ratio, the ICER. And that is the one metric that forms the basis for most of the discussion that goes on in the NICE appraisal committees about whether a drug is accepted or not accepted. And it's a bit of a slippery metric. It's worth saying that all those representations have the same ICER. So you can just swap the points around and you'll get the same ICER. So it's got to be treated very carefully. It's also a ratio measure, which means if the quality difference between two comparators is very small, you'll get an ICER value that approaches infinity, which again makes it, as I say, a very slippery metric. There's an actual output from a probabilistic model that we use. All the different all the different outputs from the cost effectiveness plane, running the simulation 1,000 times, and you can see there that the vast amount of uncertainty. It's almost impossible, given that scenario, to make a decision based on the level of uncertainty contained there. And you can put a line through that. All the points to the above the line will be above an incremental cost of effectiveness ratio of 30,000, and all those below will be below. And this is worth showing. That's a more typical representation. Here we've got a cloud of points. There's less uncertainty with this one. We looked at TMZ as a treatment for brain cancer, and you can see that only 2 points fall below the £30,000 line. So only 2 points in the graph are actually cost effectiveness at a willingness to pay threshold of 30,000 for every QALY gained. And that's represented in this standard form. And I think this is important because it shows that a common device that's very important in the decision-making process in NICE, and they use it extensively, called the cost-effectiveness acceptability curve, that shows how much you need to be willing to pay for each QALY gained for it to be probable that the treatment will be worth paying for. Okay, and the reason I mention that is because it's become a standard device within NICE for decision making. And I just want to touch on that idea that standards are very important in information visualization in terms of establishing their use. Some of the things we did was, what we wanted to do was try and make the models more transparent and more accessible to some of the people who are making the policy decisions, rather than just presenting the model outputs and letting them dwell on the outputs. Provide some techniques and tools that would allow them to play with the models and understand a little bit the dynamics of what was going on. So here's one. One of the things we discovered early on was that clinicians particularly didn't think in terms of probabilities of patients moving from one disease state to another. They thought more in terms of events, because they experienced patients who came with ACO, which is adenocarcinoma. This is a study we did for Barrett's esophagus. And they wanted to know what the likelihood or the number, the count of events would be under the different scenarios, the different treatment scenarios. And there's an example of one of the things we added to a typical model, just to show the different event counts for that, and that proved extremely useful. Here's another one that's moving on a little bit. One of the things that users often want to know is which of the variables in the model are most impactful. So we need to do a sensitivity analysis. And you can do that. You generally present a sensitivity analysis, playing with the variables and presenting it as a table, showing the outputs. But this allows users to actually play with the variables themselves. So each of these sliders allows you to play with whatever parameter is of interest, move it up or down across a specified range, and it will reflect the changes in the outputs from the model in these graphs here. So we call this the sensitivity mixing desk, because anybody can use that to play with the different input parameters of the model and see which ones impact most severely on the primary outputs, which are represented at the top. How long have we got? 5 minutes? Okay. And we moved on one step further, just in this quest to try and make the models a bit more usable and allow users to explore them and understand the dynamics. We invented something called the Visual Interactive Markov Model, or modeling, which spells VIM. Anybody who lives in the UK, VIM is a kind of cleaning powder. So I couldn't resist this advert. So there's an early prototype of the Visual Interactive Markov Model. Now, Visual Interactive modeling is very, very familiar to people who do simulation, for example. It's if you like, the dominant paradigm is you drag and drop icons and you link them together and you build models. It's virtually, I'm not aware of seeing it much in the world of Markov modeling. And I thought, why not to try and do it in the Markov modeling? So we developed this simple sort of visual representation of the Markov model, where you can actually see the model running as it goes through its cycles, and you can drill down and you can see what the states are and how many people are in the states and so on. So just to conclude, I think in terms of the general lessons we've learned from our study in health technology assessment, I think we want to move from something that's very familiar, which is the kind of model at the top, where we, the modelers and the systematic reviewers create a report that then fed to the people who are due to make the decision, and there's not really the chance for the people, the policy makers, the decision makers, to actually get to understand the model itself and play with the model, understand the dynamics, and have that greater insight that you might need to make intelligent decisions. So if we can move to the model below, where you can present tools that allow the people to begin to understand what's going on and explore some of those things, it could be extremely useful. So what needs to happen? I think primarily we need to start by understanding what the needs of the users are in visualization. That's true for HTA, but I think it's equally true for almost all the application areas we might want to consider. One of the mistakes we often made, we get seduced by the technology of visualization, but we don't think about the needs of the users. I would argue you need to start by thinking about what the user needs are, and only then move on to the technology. And then there may be very differing needs. There may be different learning styles, different levels of expertise, and all those need to be considered. And there's certainly a great deal of use that visualization can make in modeling, not just in terms of presenting outputs, but also in terms of knowledge elicitation, gathering understanding. For example, when we talk to clinicians about understanding patient pathways, we can use modeling techniques to capture that understanding from the clinicians. So one of just in that context, we developed a kind of reference model to try and capture all the key elements of visualization that we needed to consider. And there they are, some of them. Start with the user. What are the tools, techniques, things that have come up in previous presentations that I think have been emphasized, things like the constraints that we're under. I think one of the key questions somebody asked, well, what about the fact that we have to produce this thing in a black and white printed report? It's all very well getting excited about sort of animated graphics, but if you can't do that in the primary output, you need to think about how you can do it within the constraints of the media you're using. And also, what are the constraints of graphicity? What are the constraints in terms of what the audience can understand? People have argued that there needs to be courses in schools teaching people about graphicity, which is understanding graphics. And then a very important area is standards, which I don't think has been talked much about, but I think standards are incredibly important in promoting the greater use of graphics, so that we don't have to keep relearning or learning new forms of representation. Once these standards are established, that can help a great deal in promoting greater use of information graphics and greater understanding. And then finally, evaluation. It's very difficult to do, but it needs to happen if we're really going to understand what works and what doesn't work in terms of the tools that we use. That's my final slide. Visualization tools can be, and we've shown it, we've evaluated, actually we have done some evaluation, we've shown that they can be extremely useful. There's a lot more. We're only, as the British expression is, we're only just sort of seeing the tip of the iceberg here. There's an enormous amount that can be done in terms of the research agenda in developing some of these tools and working out how they can facilitate greater understanding and decision making. And they'll need to develop some systematic approaches so that we've got clear common agenda and standards that we work to. So that's me. Thank you.